Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the director of the Institute for Social Capital. And I'm also the current president of the International Social Capital Association, which we refer to as ISCA. ISCA is hosting this session, which is designed to provide an introduction to social capital for researchers. So its particular focus is on people who are fairly new to research, but I suspect that even if you're a seasoned researcher on social capital, you'll probably still get some interesting insights out of this presentation. Even if you're not conducting research, this session may still be of interest to you because I'll be talking about what social capital is and what the value of the concept, and I think those things are relevant to anybody, whether you're conducting research or not. So by way of overview, I'll first give you a brief introduction to social capital and what research with the concept would involve. Then I'll talk about the value of the concept, because it's an incredibly popular and incredibly important concept that's been applied to research across all of the social sciences and even beyond. Then I think the bulk of this presentation is on understanding the concept of social capital, because it is quite complex and there's many different meanings, and I'll give you a variety of different tools that I have developed to make sense of this very complex and very diverse literature. And as part of that, I'll talk about the outcomes of social capital, because when we can define what social capital does, then we can better understand what social capital itself is. I'll talk about what complicates the theory, why there's so many meanings of social capital and such diversity in the literature. And I'll give you an introduction to the categorizations of conceptual approaches, how we might be able to start to divide up and make sense of the diversity that exists in the literature. And then I'll talk about the challenges of reading the literature and of conducting research, and particularly focus on how we can use those tools that I'll show you to better understand what's going on in the literature. And then some details about further support. Then I'll stop the recording and we'll have some discussion and questions, and I have a few questions for you. So as I go through, if you think about and engage with this content in the context of your research or your interests, then you'll be prepared to answer some of the questions that I'll pose at the end. In terms of getting started with social capital, it's a puzzling concept. The combination of the words social and capital can be a bit puzzling. It's a bit cumbersome even, perhaps, but it's certainly intriguing. And it implies that social relationships are valuable and important. And I think that's consistent across all of the research applications of social capital. Of course, this is not a new or a novel idea. We all use what we call social capital in our daily lives. Every organization, every part of society uses social capital. So it's not new, it's not novel, but we're giving it a term, we're giving it some shape and some substance, and we're able to then do something with it. And that's important because it's often overlooked and undervalued, particularly in the last decades. And really what it does is it highlights those social and cultural processes that can be corrective to asocial ways of thinking about our organizations, politics, media, education, and virtually any other area of modern life. And all of this has sparked incredible interest in the topic, going all the way back to the 1990s when it really took off as a concept. It's spread across all of the social sciences and beyond, and there's tens of thousands of articles on social capital every year, and the popularity of the concept doesn't seem to be diminishing even 3 decades on. And I think that its popularity speaks to this need and usefulness of the concept, and it's something that I think we need to improve our understanding of so that we can improve the usefulness of the research that we're doing on the concept. But because of its widespread interest, it's been used by different disciplines, it's been applied to different levels of analysis and to different contexts, and as a result, there's many different meanings and approaches in the literature. And this can be really confusing. Trust me, I know for probably the first 10 years of being interested in social capital, I was regularly scratching my head and confused by what was going on and frustrated with the state of the literature. And that's really what's motivated me to create these schemas and tools to help to understand the literature, to make it easier for you, so you don't have to spend 10 years trying to figure it all out. In the literature, there's different conceptual approaches, and quite often there's mismatched approaches where scholars have taken ideas from quite different theoretical foundations and simply joined them in together, which can be difficult to read in the literature and confuse things even more. And of course, measurement is an ongoing challenge. There are hundreds of different ways, maybe thousands of different ways to measure social capital that exist in the literature. But there isn't a blueprint. There isn't a one accepted way of doing it. And as a result of this, there has been some poor scholarship in the literature where social capital has been measured in ways that perhaps we would say is less than scholarly. But we can rectify that, of course. We can do better. So if we move on to talking about what the value of the concept is, I think the brief introduction I just gave to the concept should probably illustrate what is important and why it's a valuable concept. And the first thing is that it communicates something that is so often overlooked and undervalued. And it's part of a trend in recent decades to communicate the non-economic, if you like, value of as capital. So this includes natural capital, human capital, intellectual capital, and there's many other forms of capital now that try to communicate the value of these things. And there's also other attempts to communicate the value of social processes that aren't necessarily using the term capital, such as social impact or social value or social investment and so forth. And I think the other major value of the concept is that it provides a way of understanding, but also a way of improving things as well. So it allows us to be more aware of its importance in influencing behavior, and that allows us to identify and implement simple ways to improve the social capital of a particular situation and the social outcomes that may result. And we can also identify and avoid things that may be costly or damaging. Social capital is not new, but by being purposeful and deliberate about understanding the value of social and cultural processes, we can then both maximize the opportunities and minimize the risks at the same time. We move on then to try to get an understanding of what social capital is. And because there's so many different meanings that exist in the literature, I'd like to try and step back from that a bit and see if we can see the forest for the trees. So if we break it down, the word social implies that it relates to interactions between people. And at the micro level, that could be social relationships, or at the macro level, perhaps that's the nature of social organization and structure. Social is certainly a very broad term that has a lot of different meanings, but it certainly relates to people and interactions between people. Capital, on the other hand, implies some sort of a potential ability or capacity. It's something that we can invest in with an expectation of return in future. It permits increased production or outcomes in the future, and it can be invested in as well as maintained, depreciated, and enhanced. And that's the core idea of capital. The fundamental characteristic is that it's a potential to do something or provide something. It can yield productive services. It's not its outcomes, though. And I think that's a really important point that we need to stay focused on, is that social capital is not what it does. That's, I think, a really important thing that gets confused sometimes in the theory. But if we're going to use the word capital, a fundamental characteristic of capital is that it's a potential. And we see this across all of the other forms of capital as well. For example, physical capital, a bus is physical capital. A bus can transport people. But the transportation of people is not the physical capital. The physical capital is the bus. Transporting people is merely the service that the physical capital provides. I think that's a very simple example to illustrate how the capital of social capital really should be the potential to provide the services or the future benefits or outcomes. So if we look at we've just talked about what social capital is in a very broad kind of way, but what does it actually do? And in the literature, there's many examples are cited. So social capital does things like facilitating cooperation, collective action, information flows, social introduction, social support, all of these kinds of things. And what I've tried to do is look at, well, these seem to be examples. So what is the superordinate here? What are these examples of exactly that we could describe? And what I came up with is perhaps these are examples of social actions in a very broad kind of sense. And so we could say that social capital facilitates, enables, encourages these types of social actions. And of course, we can't ignore the intrinsic outcomes that are associated with that potential for action as well, such as psychological well-being or happiness or feeling a sense of belonging and all of those kinds of things. And if we take this a bit further and explore what types of social actions are outcomes of social capital, because of course, social actions potentially encompass absolutely everything to do with human activity, we could start breaking it down and identifying some that we certainly think are outcomes of social capital, and perhaps some that are not. So this first mode of acting, and I gave a webinar on this a couple of months ago, if you'd like to explore this in much more detail. One mode of acting is acting with others. So this is collective action or coordinated action in the pursuit of shared goals. And I think everybody would agree that this is most definitely an outcome of social capital, no doubt at all. Another mode of acting is acting towards others directly. So these are those actions that involve or impact or relate to or accommodate directly in the pursuit of others' goals. So this is where you help somebody or you make a social introduction for somebody. It's not your goal you're pursuing per se, it's their goal, but you're acting directly towards them. And I think, again, everybody just about would agree that this is also an outcome of social capital, these types of actions. And then we move on to actions relating to or affecting others indirectly. So these may be actions related to common property resources that don't directly affect others, but do indirectly affect others. And now we're into perhaps a gray area where this certainly could be considered to be outcomes of social capital, but perhaps not. And depending on your conceptual approach or your understanding or your focus, this may or may not be, these types of actions may or may not be outcomes of social capital. And then we have a very, very broad category of actions that are influenced by others. So these actions shaped by the expectations, obligations, or actions of others, but not affecting or relating to others. So examples that I've provided here are things like personal health or exercise actions, patterns of media consumption, educational choices. These actions are influenced by others, but they don't impact or affect others directly, or perhaps even indirectly. And so again, this is up for debate about whether these types of actions are outcomes of social capital or not. So if we put this together into a little schema of capital, so based on capital theory, we have the investment or byproduct that creates the potential, which is what we're saying social capital is, that can provide the future benefits or returns. And there are some questions outstanding in the literature, or certainly lots of different perspectives at the very least about this. What creates the potential? What is the potential? And I think what are the outcomes? At least we've got some broad categories that we can start to fill in here and say that, well, it's social action. And it's also the intrinsic outcomes associated with that potential for action. But the form, what social capital actually is still a bit of a question mark. And certainly there's lots of different perspectives in the literature. And fundamentally, this question relates to why do humans act cooperatively? That's the core question of social capital. So if we expand on this schema a little bit of social capital, because it's all well and good to say that it produces future benefits or returns, but where are the action-based outcomes? How does this fit into the overall perspective? So we're saying that the investment or byproduct creates the potential that then facilitates the actions of individuals that then contributes to the future benefits or returns. And I've provided some examples here that we've already talked about the types of actions, perhaps, that are outcomes of social capital. And I'm also going to include here some examples of these future benefits or returns. So you'll see that they're different things than the actions. And really, in things like innovation and creativity or improved productivity, economic development, these are outcomes that are the result of individual actions, or at least contributed to as a result of individual actions. And this is only a small list of a huge range of possible future benefits or returns that we may be interested in. And you'll find all of these and many, many more in the literature. Now, I think the idea about context is really important because many outcomes of social capital involve mobilizing, activating, enhancing, or transforming other forms of capital. So the actions of individuals, sure, but if those other forms of capital don't exist, aren't available within that context, then various future benefits and returns cannot exist, cannot be provided. And the example that I've provided here is that if no one in a village has a tractor, physical capital, then it cannot be loaned, borrowed, or shared. So there may be cooperation and collective action and social support and so forth. Those actions may be available. They may be likely to occur as a result of the potential that we're calling social capital. But if the physical capital doesn't exist, it removes the possibility for a whole range of potential benefits and returns in the future. So this has led a lot of people in the literature to talk about social capital in the context of resources. And you'll find the word resources consistently in the literature. Perhaps about 20 to 30% of articles make some sort of reference to resources. I'll talk about resources a little bit later because it can have a variety of different meanings. So if we try to focus in on what this potential is, what is the potential of social capital? And I've tried to provide some examples from the literature here that perhaps represents the paradigm of social capital. And we could look at any one of these ideas about what the potential is, and we could explore how it results in future benefits or returns. So if we take network configuration, for example, which is one of the common approaches in the literature, we can understand how the way in which people are connected to others within social networks represents a potential for future social action and therefore various future benefits and returns. So I completely agree. Network configuration is a potential that represents and fits within this paradigm of social capital. And we could pick any of these others. Social norms is also very commonly used in the literature to define the expectations that people have towards certain types of action. And if we can shape those social norms in ways that encourage cooperation and collective action and helping and sharing and so forth, that's a potential. It sits there, it can be maintained, it can be depreciated, we can invest in it by shaping those social norms, and then it can provide future returns. And we could go through this for absolutely any one of, or every single one of these. Social identity, of course, the way we could develop goodwill within a particular social grouping that can provide a future potential benefit. So this perhaps, and this isn't everything, these are just examples. There's many other ideas that exist within the literature. So social capital exists at different levels. I think this is important to recognize because if you understand social capital for an individual, you may think of different types of aspects of that potential than if you think about it for an organization or for a society. For example, if I think about my own social capital, I have some control over that. I can go out and meet people. I can develop my social relationships. I can be trustworthy. I can give and help people and develop goodwill. I can develop a strong reputation for acting cooperatively and so forth. So I certainly have some control over my social capital, and I can build it and make use of it and benefit from it. But then if we think about the social capital of an organization, we may be more interested in looking at the social norms that exist, what those overall behavioral expectations are that exist within the organization, how people feel about the trustworthiness of other individuals, about the nature of the social identity within that organization, and various other factors. But we could certainly understand the social capital of an organization. And I've just talked about it in quite a different way than I talked about the social capital of an individual. And the main reason for the difference is because an individual can only control certain aspects of that potential of social capital. It's difficult for an individual to control the wider social norms that influence the nature of people's expectations, whereas an organization may be able to influence those things within their organization at least. An organization, of course, wants to facilitate and encourage social relationships to exist, but an organization per se does not have explicit control over that beyond providing opportunities for people to get together and to engage in and develop their social relationships. So the level of interest then has a pretty big role on how we see and what aspects of social capital we're interested in. And we can certainly understand how social capital exists between people, within groups and organizations, as well as within communities and society overall, depending on what your interest and your focus is. So I've developed this slide to lay out some of the different factors that create this complexity, all of these different definitions and conceptual approaches. So I talked already about the level of interest just now. There's also the perspective of benefit, whether or not this is an asset or something that individuals can benefit from, or it's something that the collective can benefit from, or perhaps it's both a public good and a private good. Of course, different methodological requirements also will influence how we define and conceptualize social capital. And of course, the theory of human experience, or the various schools of thought or theoretical foundations that may influence this as well. If our discipline requirements mean that we have to be focused on self-interested individuals as utility maximizers, then that, of course, is going to shape the way in which we define and conceptualize the concept of social capital. However, if we see human experience as socially situated, then again, it's going to be something that is quite different in the way that we define and conceptualize it. Regardless of all of this, I think we still can have this paradigm where we can make sense of all of the different approaches that exist in the literature and not see them as being incorrect, and not see them as being complementary, perhaps. Yes, network configuration is definitely a potential. I can see and understand that. And there's lots of other ways we can make sense of the overall literature here as well. So in the literature, you'll find different attempts to categorize these conceptual approaches. And I've given you 4 of these attempts here on this slide. There are others as well, people who have put all of these different understandings into categories or boxes. I'm not going to talk too much more about this because I'm going to give you a set of conceptual approaches, categories that I think works quite well, and it's based on drawing out common themes that exist within the literature. I will make these slides available to everybody after the presentation as well. So the common themes that I've identified in the literature when looking at hundreds and hundreds of definitions of social capital is things like social networks, social structure, trust, trustworthiness, shared norms, resources, benefits, cooperations. These are the themes that are typically coming up in the literature. And I've tried to group these together and say, well, networks and network structure and social structure, this relates to connectedness. This relates to that opportunity for people to be able to interact with each other. And so I've just called it connectedness here. Trust and trustworthiness and shared norms, and there's a lot of other things as well, very similar. We could call sociability. It's really about the nature of social interactions when they do occur. Another term I've been using recently to describe this is perhaps the predispositions that people have towards one another and the interactions that they have with each other. Resources is pretty straightforward, and really benefits and cooperation are outcomes of social capital. So I'm not sure they really have a place in definitions, because it makes them contingent on certain types of outcomes, rather than more broadly trying to understand what this potential is, what social capital actually is. So if we put this into a diagram, we could start to define some conceptual approaches. So these three main themes that I've identified, if the focus is primarily on the network structure, the network and the network structure, then we could call this the network approach. If the focus is on the network and the resources that are available within that network for mobilization, then we could call that the resource approach. And if it's focused on the network and the norms, the trust and the goodwill and so forth that exist within that network, then we could call that the normative, or perhaps the communitarian approach is sometimes used to describe this. So then we have these three categories of conceptual approaches, but there's some things missing. Notably, Pierre Bourdieu's work doesn't fit into any one of those three categories particularly neatly. So I think that is a distinct approach on its own. And then, of course, we have all of the heterodox approaches, all the other approaches that don't fit really at all into those other four categories. So I'm going to give you a short explanation of each of these so that you can identify them in the literature when you see them. And particularly, I'll give you some key authors that will help you to identify them when you see them in the literature. So from the network approach, social capital is the connections between individuals, their social network that produces the benefits. And it focuses on the structure of network. And it's really important to identify that this is not a single approach, but a variety of different approaches that have the similarity of focusing on the structure of the network. And so you find network analysis terms like mapping, like directionality, like reciprocity, and we can attribute this approach attributes qualities to the social structure: density, multiplexity, segregation, structural holes, leadership boundaries, and bridges. If you see these types of terms, and you're probably reading literature that broadly at least fits within the network approach. And some of the key authors, particularly the key early authors, were Ron Burt and Mark Granovetter. The next one is the resource approach, which I think has a lot of similarity, perhaps, to the network approach, but it's focused on the resources mobilized through social networks. And this is essentially a rebranding of social resource theory. Nan Lin wrote a book that ended up being called Social Capital, but it was really about social resource theory. And the word resources has come to have a lot of different meanings in the literature. Nan Lin originally defined it as the wealth, status, power, as well as the social ties of those persons who are directly or indirectly linked to the individual. But resources has come to also mean information and physical capital and a variety of other resources, which to me really confuses the situation considerably. Because, of course, information and physical capital and so forth are other forms of capital, not social capital. Key author of the resource approach is most definitely Nan Lin, but of course there's been many hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars who have followed his work. The normative approach, very broadly, is the nature of social organization. And it really focuses on the normative social structural arrangements that result from actors working together for mutual benefit. So the focus is on norms that maintain and organize interactions between individuals, the values and beliefs, and it tends to focus on culture and socialization, internalization of norms and values. And broadly speaking, key authors here are Jim Coleman and Bob Putnam, certainly as the founding authors or the early authors of this approach. I think there's some debate about whether they both fit perfectly into this, and it's really a very broad conceptual approach that is very dominant in the literature. I think this is probably the most common approach, and it's incredibly diverse. We then have Bourdieu's approach, which I've put separately because it's really quite different than all of the others. Because from Bourdieu's approach, it enables a person to exert power on a group or individual who mobilizes the resources. And it's part of a very well-developed theoretical project that looks at capital as not just economic, and that social exchanges are not purely self-interested, and this need to encompass capital and profit in all their forms. And so his work emphasizes the structural constraints and the unequal access to institutional resources based on class, gender, race, and his approach is grounded in theories of social reproduction and symbolic power. So in this way, it's quite distinctly different from the other approaches that tend to universalize across different social groupings. Bourdieu's approach explicitly is interested in social reproduction and power. So it is really quite different and distinct. And then, of course, we have all of the heterodox approaches, which is just lumping in all of the others that don't fit neatly into the other categories. It tends to be elusive and difficult to identify, but I've provided a few examples here. An approach that focuses on goodwill isn't networks, it's not really normative, it's not really, so it's kind of fits here as a heterodox approach. Lyndon Robertson and co-authors focusing on sympathy is another example that doesn't fit particularly well into the other categories. But what I've found overall is that it's very difficult to place any one paper into one of these categories. And increasingly, I question the value of these conceptual categories overall. Like it helps to make sense of a literature. We can see certain authors and we can understand perhaps the intellectual history that author may have, coming, say, from network theories or coming from social resource theory or whatever it may be. So there is value here, but any one paper almost never fits neatly into one of these categories. So it is a bit of a challenge. And of course, we could categorize the conceptual approaches differently, as other authors have done. So if we talk about the challenges of reading the literature, I think I only have about 2 or 3 more slides to go. There's lots of different meanings, theoretical foundations, different methods, and some of the literature is quite mixed and confused. As I mentioned earlier, some people take different ideas from different places and join them together, and they're not necessarily aware of the theoretical foundations that exist, and you can get some confusion going on. And in fact, it's quite common, or at least there are some tautologies in the literature, which is really a statement that is true by virtue of its logical form alone. And so any research that involves a tautology is really a self-fulfilling prophecy. You simply get exactly what you're looking for, because of course your statement is true by virtue of its logical form. And this is quite common in critiques of social capital, that tautologies are talked about. And over time, there have been developed some unjustified assumptions in the literature as well. I joke about social capital being the Wild West, that there aren't very many rules. People kind of do whatever they like. They combine different proxies or different indicators of social capital in different ways, however they like. And there isn't really anybody that seems to be capable of critiquing the research that's produced. And as a result, most of it gets published in peer-reviewed journals, and there's some pretty wild stuff out there that has some pretty poor scholarship. And certainly Ben Fine has talked about this extensively, and if you're interested in further critiques, then I would recommend his work. And of course, the different schools of thought tend to result in very different language to describe the same or perhaps similar ideas. And this can be a challenge. I'm not an economist, but quite often when I'm reading the literature, I'll come across terms such as relational goods or attachment value or commodities, deeds, exchange. And these, I don't immediately understand these things. But when I dig into it and I try to understand what the author means, or if I have the opportunity to talk with the scholar, then I find that their ideas actually are much the same as mine, just using different language to describe it. And I think very often we talk past each other because we define social capital differently, and so we just assume the other person is wrong. when so often actually that they make a very valid point, and perhaps they're talking about things very similar to ourselves, just using different language or focusing on a different aspect of that potential. And this is the reason, these challenges are the reason why I've developed the logic schema, the paradigm outline, and the conceptual approaches diagram that I presented in this session, to help you to try and make sense of the literature and what social capital is, and how it fits, and where it goes. The paradigm with these different aspects that are focused on in the literature of what creates the potential, and perhaps also the conceptual categories. So I'll make these slides available afterwards, as I mentioned. So challenges of conducting research on social capital. First thing you really need to do is to choose a definition and conceptual approach. Get really clear about what social capital is, how it works. You might need to read quite widely in order to do this. But if you're vague about what social capital is and how it works, and what the theoretical foundations are, then your research isn't going to go anywhere particularly productive. You could end up being confused and just not being able to design quality research. So I think that is really critical. When you're doing the literature review, if you have been very clear about your definition, it will help, because the literature by now is tens of thousands of articles big. So if you try to be extremely broad and include everything, you can't possibly achieve circularity in your literature review. It's just far too big a body of literature. So getting clear on what the meaning of social capital is for you, and the conceptual approach will be very, very helpful. And then measurement, of course, is an ongoing challenge, as I mentioned. And there is no blueprint. I'm asked almost every day, it feels like I'm asked, how do I measure social capital? And there's no one answer, because you need to explore, well, what does social capital mean for you? What does it mean in your research context? What is the nature of this potential? What is the outcomes that you're interested in? There's so many questions that need to go into developing and identifying an appropriate measurement technique. But of course, social capital can be measured, and it has been measured in hundreds, if not possibly thousands of different ways by the huge body of literature that exists. So it is possible. You just need to dig into it and design something that's appropriate and suitable for your research project. Of course, social capital, some aspects are tangible, some aspects are intangible, some aspects are dynamic. This can be a challenge for research. You need to be aware of that. And I think just about everybody would agree that social capital is multidimensional as well. So taking account of those dimensions in your measurement is important. And for every research, data availability it can be a challenge. And this is particularly true if you're doing a large, like a community level or societal level focus on social capital. You may be trying to use data that was collected for a very different purpose, and therefore its connection to the theory may be a little tenuous, to say the least. But this is a challenge that everybody has, so it's not particularly unique. But what I will say about data collection is that many of these aspects of social capital are, say, pre-reflective, or people aren't necessarily aware of them immediately. You ask somebody about trust, they may not be able to answer that question without reflecting and thinking about what they really, what their experience is within their social group or society to be able to answer it. But again, this is not a unique problem for social capital, but it's something that I think is important to be aware of. And I've written articles on many of these topics, and given webinars about a lot of these as well. So you'll find a lot of that if you're looking for it. In terms of further support, of course, membership in ISCA is a fantastic place to start. Join a community of people who are interested in social capital and attend events and so forth. And there's more information on the ISCA website if you haven't joined already. ISCA has lots of free events. These are some examples: discussion groups and research design sessions designed specifically for social capital, webinars, and so forth. So it's great to get involved with the association. And the Institute for Social Capital as well has over 200 articles available for free online that dig into dimensions and levels and measurement and a whole variety of different topics. And we also have some online courses, particularly designed for conducting research on social capital, that go significantly beyond what we've talked about today. So that's the end of the presentation component. I'll just stop the recording.